This video is part 2 in a 2-part series. Part 1 can be found in the description. You'll also find a link to our Patreon, where you can join our supporters who make these videos possible. Mr. King, sir? I have bad news. France joined the war, and Spain isn't far behind. What? Where are our allies? We don't have any, sir. Oh dear. How are the Army and Navy doing? Terribly, sir. Don't you have any good news? I actually do. We just discovered a secret weapon that can help us win the war. Really? What is it? They're calling it a sandwich. What the heck are we supposed to do with a sandwich? Back during the 7 Years' War, the British Royal Navy successfully trapped most of the French fleet in port early in the conflict. This was a major reason for their victory, but since then, Parliament had defunded the Royal Navy to help cope with its debts. Now that France was part of the war, someone in England had to figure out how to fight another global naval conflict with a reduced Royal Navy. This task fell to England's First Lord of the Admiralty, John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, who, yes, is the namesake of the sandwich. Supposedly, Lord Sandwich was so conscientious that he popularized meat in bread so he could keep working at his desk through lunch. Sandwich's Royal Navy had to convoy supplies and reinforcements to North America, convoy armies within the theater, blockade the North American coast, defend British trade from the Baltic Sea to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and defend from invasion all of the British Isles, India, Minorca, Gibraltar, West Africa, Canada, and the Caribbean. Defending the home islands was Sandwich's top priority, which left few ships for America. The Royal Navy would instead try to defend America by intercepting French fleets before they could leave Europe. But the interceptions didn't work, meaning French fleets and armies were able to help the Americans in their theater. However, the British Caribbean is where the true prizes lay. France took Dominica in 1778, St. Vincent and Grenada in 1779, and Tobago in 1781. But focusing on home defense at least meant England was able to maintain its control over the Channel when the Royal Navy stalemated the French in the Battle of Ushant on July 27, 1778. France's entry caused Parliament to begin losing faith in the war. The Prime Minister, Lord North, hardly wanted the conflict to begin with. He was mostly pressured to stay in office by King George III, who was not alone in believing that the loss of America meant the end of the British Empire. The United Kingdom's debts would almost double before the war was over. Much of that money would be spent by Lord Sandwich, making the Royal Navy great again. Given enough time, he might be able to save the British Empire, or at least what was left of it. Congratulations on your promotion to Commander-in-Chief, General Clinton. I'm your aide-de-camp, and it's my job to show you around your new command. This is the luxurious mansion you'll be staying in while you're leading the army in North America. I resign. These are the brave British soldiers prepared to fight and die at your command. I resign. And this is the massive pile of money, fame, and money you'll be awarded by the king if you win the war. I resign. And this is, a letter from the King and Parliament replying to your request to resign. Really? What does it say? It says here, no. I resign. In May 1778, General Henry Clinton replaced William Howe as Commander-in-Chief in North America. Clinton's command would be an unhappy one, mostly because he didn't want it. Though not as opposed as the Howes, Clinton did not love the policies that had led to the war. Now that France had joined, he believed the military situation was hopeless and did not want his reputation ruined by the defeat. In an effort to avoid the job, Clinton tried resigning as soon as he was made second in command to Howe. And even after becoming Commander-in-Chief, Clinton continued tendering his resignation for the rest of his command. It didn't help that one of Clinton's first orders from Parliament was to send 8,000 men from his already tiny army to reinforce the Caribbean, Canada, and Florida. He tried resigning again as soon as he heard the order, only to be rejected by the government with its apologies. Prime Minister North also tried resigning, but was pressured to remain by the king. General Clinton had once advised Howe against taking Philadelphia. Now that he was in command, Parliament ordered him to abandon the city and retreat to either New York or Halifax. The latter option meant abandoning the colonies almost entirely, so Clinton chose New York. But because Sandwich had moved much of the Royal Navy out of North America, Clinton had to take the land route, which meant getting harassed the whole way by the Continental Army. This was no longer the amateur force Howe had bested in battle after battle, but an increasingly professional military trained by European advisors. On June 28th, Washington's army caught up with Clinton's rearguard at Monmouth Courthouse. Clinton expertly averted catastrophe by sending Cornwallis back with reinforcements to repel the Americans. Both sides fought to exhaustion, and the British withdrew in the night. Clinton's army safely reached New York in July, but he didn't send out the 8,000 men until October. Unable to carry out offensives, Clinton used his reduced force to defend Rhode Island from a combined French-American attack, which he successfully repulsed. In April of 1779, Spain signed the Treaty of Aranjuez with France, turning Spain into a French ally. Though they signed no alliance with America, the Spanish declared war in June. Spain's objectives were to reclaim territories lost to Britain in the preceding decades. These included Florida, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and most importantly, Gibraltar and Minorca. Gibraltar was immediately besieged by a combined Franco-Spanish army. In fact, the rock was so important to Spain that their treaty forbade France from exiting the war before it was retaken. A clause that would later cause considerable problems with the Americans. Back in North America, Bernardo del Galvez was the governor of Spanish Louisiana. Before Spain joined the war, he was leading Spanish efforts to support the Americans. Shortly after Spain's declaration, the governor intercepted a letter from Lord George Germain intended for the commander of British Florida, ordering him to invade Spanish Louisiana. Galvez preempted this with his own invasion of West Florida, which at the time extended as far as the Mississippi River. Galvez's campaign ended in triumph on May 10, 1781, when he captured West Florida's capital at Pensacola. But that wasn't the only failed scheme Germain hatched against the Spanish. He also championed what would become a doomed expedition to take Spanish Central America. Following their defeat in the 7 Years' War, France and Spain had aggressively rebuilt their navies. Now, their combined fleets were almost 50% bigger than the whole Royal Navy, and outnumbered it 2-1 in the English Channel. The Allies prepared to take advantage and invade England in July of 1779, but the plan was foiled by a combination of storms, lack of supplies, and growing sickness among the invading forces. As the war escalated, the Royal Navy found itself blockading an ever-growing portion of global trade. In 1780, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Russia got sick of it and formed the League of Armed Neutrality, intended to protect their trade from British search and seizure. By the war's end, the League's members would include the Netherlands, Prussia, Austria, Portugal, and the very accurately named Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The United Kingdom was fast running out of friends. Shortly after Clinton took command, Lord George Germain hatched yet another plot to win the war. Since the Loyalists weren't turning out in the northern colonies or the middle colonies, it followed they must have all been hiding in the southern colonies. Therefore, he believed British war efforts should be refocused in the south. The southern campaign already began in late 1778, when 3,000 of the men Clinton dispatched to Florida invaded Georgia and quickly occupied it. But that experience was enough for Clinton to conclude that there were not enough loyalists to hold Georgia, or the rest of the South. By the start of 1780, Clinton was sufficiently reinforced to launch the first major offensive of his command. Since the war was turning south anyway, he sailed his army to Charleston, South Carolina, and took it in a spectacular siege between March and May. Not only was Charleston the largest and most prosperous city in the South, Clinton also captured with it 7 generals, 4 frigates, hundreds of artillery pieces, and over 3,000 prisoners. The victory only cost Clinton 76 dead. And, to avenge America's refusal to honor the Saratoga Convention, Clinton denied the surrendering garrison full honors. Following his victory, Clinton received his much sought-after permission to resign, which he would severely regret not taking. Instead, the ever-reluctant commander-in-chief worked on pacifying the rest of South Carolina and raising regiments of loyalist troops. Hidden within the American War for Independence had always been elements of a civil war. Clinton's efforts to recruit loyalists were more successful in the South than anywhere else in America, but that caused the simmering Civil War to explode out into the open. Just as thousands of loyalists answered the British call to arms, thousands more joined patriot partisan bands in the countryside. Vicious backcountry fighting, and often plain murder of men and their families ensued. But Clinton returned to New York before the worst of it became apparent. Command in the South was handed off to General Cornwallis. This parting was fortunate, as relations between the generals had soured during the Siege of Charleston. Back in New York, the commanders-in-chief, Washington and Clinton, spent much of the rest of the war in the 18th century military equivalent of a staring contest. Each thought the battle for the fate of America would be fought there and by them. Instead, it was Cornwallis who was fated to lead British forces in the final battle for North America. Now that Clinton was in New York, and barely on speaking terms, Cornwallis functionally had an independent command in the South. Like so many men who'd led British armies in North America, Cornwallis was an enemy of the policies that had caused the war. Now, he was expected to win it. Cornwallis's orders were to pacify South Carolina, occupy North Carolina, and invade Virginia. It was hoped that Loyalist troops and militias would play a key role here. But Patriot militias were hunting down many of the Loyalist units before they could rendezvous with British armies. Cornwallis had more success against the Continental Army in the South. On August 16, 1780, he fought and completely destroyed it at the Battle of Camden. He followed up this victory by taking Charlotte, North Carolina on September 26th. There too, attempts to raise Loyalist units were stymied by Patriot militias. The most significant case being the October 7th Battle of Kings Mountain, where 900 Loyalists were butchered by Patriot militias. Patriot attacks against British troops and supplies got so bad, Cornwallis was forced to abandon North Carolina in a terrible march south that saw many men, including Cornwallis himself, fall ill, though he would retake the city in 1781. By this point, Congress managed to scratch together another army to oppose Cornwallis, but rather than fight him directly, this new army led the British on a 250-mile chase across the Carolinas. They defeated one of Cornwallis's detachments at Cowpens, but when the two whole armies met at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th, Cornwallis proved the victor. But between that battle and the pursuit, Cornwallis's original force of 5,500 men was reduced to just 1,500. Cornwallis decided to abandon the Carolinas and focus on the last of the 13 colonies to see any major fighting, Virginia. Virtually untouched by the war, the colony of Virginia was caught terribly unprepared by the invasion. British forces had destroyed the capital of Richmond. Now they penetrated deep into the state, capturing key figures, seizing supplies, occupying strategic objectives, and very nearly catching the state's governor, writer of the Declaration of Independence, and future president, Thomas Jefferson, in his home at Monticello. Cornwallis's main goal in Virginia was to establish a new British headquarters along the Chesapeake coast. Fatefully, Clinton recommended Yorktown, but neither commander was aware of the trap they were digging themselves into. Yorktown was a good port and a strong defensive position, but only if it could be resupplied by sea. If the Allies won naval superiority, it would only serve as a tomb. Which begs the question, where's the Royal Navy been all this time? By this stage in the war, the most important location to the revolutionary cause was not anywhere in the 13 colonies. Rather, it was the tiny Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. After France and Spain joined the war, the neutral island became the new hub of nearly all trade into the colonies, including vital war materials. In December of 1780, using a draft treaty between America and the Netherlands as a pretext, the United Kingdom declared war on the Dutch, forcing them to leave the League of Armed Neutrality. On February 3, 1781, a British fleet commanded by Admiral George Bridges Rodney arrived at St. Eustatius. "Congratulations, Governor of St. Eustatius! You've been conquered. Please do not resist." "What? We're not even at war." "Actually, we are at war. Here's the declaration. It says here..." "Oh, wait. Oh no! What a tragedy! I guess he won't be needing his governor's mansion anymore. Say, what property do you own on the island?" "I own all the warehouses here on St. Eustatius." "Achoo! I guess he won't be needing those warehouses anymore. And how about you? What do you own on the island?" I don't own anything important." "Well, do you have any loose pocket change?" Yes." "Achoo! My loose change now." At the time of Admiral Rodney's arrival, the Dutch of St. Eustatius did not know they were at war with England. After his arrival, Rodney did not just shut down the island's trade, he spent 3 months pillaging it. Private property, even down to petty cash, was seized. Rodney claimed his actions were justified because St. Eustatius was nothing but a hive of scum and villainy. But even if that were true, it would not have justified plunder after it surrendered. But Admiral Rodney had his own reasons for looting the island. The Admiral had been bankrupted by a lavish lifestyle and a gambling addiction. When the war broke out, he was so deep in personal debt, he was hiding in Paris to escape his creditors. This matters because the Royal Navy's prize system shared loot between the government, ship crews, and importantly for Rodney, commanding admirals. He stood to make a fortune from St. Eustatius, one big enough to pay off his creditors and probably live big for the rest of his life. The sales from the island would total between £4 and £5 million, the biggest catch of the century. Rodney had certainly planned this long in advance. A few months before, he sailed to New York just to claim superiority over Admiral Arbuthnot, who had replaced Richard Howe as Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy in North America. Doing so entitled Rodney to a larger share of the prize, which Arbuthnot complained was the only reason Rodney came to New York in the first place. He also complained that Rodney stole his ships, sailors, and supplies before leaving. Perhaps worst of all, Rodney's full orders were not just to capture St. Eustatius. He was also supposed to intercept the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which was destined to seal Cornwallis in at Yorktown. Instead, Rodney sailed back to England to defend his actions. On September 28, 1781, a combined Franco-American army besieged Cornwallis at Yorktown. Admiral de Grasse blockaded him from the sea. Not only did the Allied army terribly outnumber Cornwallis, the French happened to be the best siege engineers in Europe. This is where Rodney's actions became a serious problem. Despite his obvious war crimes, Rodney was an excellent admiral. His resupply efforts were one of the key reasons Gibraltar survived under siege for so long. But with Rodney in Great Britain, the battle to relieve Cornwallis was instead led by Sir Thomas Graves. And because Rodney did not send any ships to help, Graves only had 19 ships of the line to fight de Grasse's 24. A problem made even worse when you consider that French ships of the line were more powerful than English ones. The two fleets met on September 5th, 1781. Any chance the British had of winning was lost when lack of standardized signaling in the Royal Navy led the British to botch their battle plan. After an inconclusive exchange of fire, Graves was forced to withdraw. General Clinton in New York also tried to relieve Cornwallis, but his army departed too late. So on October 19, 1781, after a promising chance to escape was stopped by a storm, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. General Cornwallis's army was far from the only British force occupying the 13 colonies. They still held New York City, South Carolina, and parts of Georgia. What truly changed after Yorktown was not Britain's ability to fight, but its will to. March of 1782 saw the reluctantly pro-war North Ministry replaced by the enthusiastically pro-peace Rockingham Whigs. Peace negotiations began soon after. But Britain's position seemed to be growing weaker by the day. That year saw de Grasse capture much of the remaining British Caribbean: St. Kitts, Montreat, and Nevis. In the Mediterranean, Minorca was captured by a combined Franco-Spanish fleet, while Gibraltar, still under siege, seemed liable to fall at any moment. Only England's most important island, Jamaica, was left. Despite the disaster Admiral Rodney almost single-handedly caused at Yorktown, Parliament chose to promote him to Vice Admiral of Great Britain, and gave him command over a large fleet to fight de Grasse and save Jamaica. On April 12, 1782, Rodney's fleet intercepted de Grasse carrying troops for an invasion of Jamaica. Rodney had 36 ships of the line against de Grasse's 30. Like Nelson at Trafalgar decades later, Rodney crossed the T of de Grasse's formation, sailing his ships through the gaps in the French line and blasting it to pieces. Rodney captured 4 ships of the line, destroyed a 5th, and captured Admiral de Grasse himself. Thousands of French soldiers intended to invade Jamaica were also killed. This victory at the Battle of the Saints single-handedly changed the course of the war in Britain's favor, and turned Rodney from likely pariah to a national war hero. The Saints was as much the Earl of Sandwich's victory as it was Rodney's. Though out of office since March, Sandwich architected the Royal Navy's return to greatness. Without Sandwich's naval construction programs and reforms, including the introduction of copper bottoms, Rodney never would have had the ships he used to defeat de Grasse. Sandwich more than just helped save the British Empire. He so reinvigorated the Royal Navy that his foundation would propel it to the hallowed heights it attained during the Napoleonic Wars and broader 19th century. But following the Saints, it was enough that Sandwich and Rodney won the leverage Britain needed to make a tolerable peace. One of the most important questions for British diplomats was whether to make a separate peace with the Americans or try to negotiate with all of the Allies together. In a way, the Spanish made that decision for them. Do you remember how America and France forbade each other from making separate peace? And then how one of the conditions of France's alliance with Spain was a commitment to stay in the war until after Gibraltar was captured? Yeah, well, that means France effectively bound America to continue the war until after Spain took Gibraltar, something the Americans never agreed to. This betrayal wasn't the only reason the Americans wanted out. Both France and America were approaching bankruptcy. Defeat at the Saints meant France couldn't do much more in North America. and the Americans were even afraid that the French might abandon them and make a separate peace first. None of that meant the Americans wouldn't insist on generous terms to abandon their partner. The terms looked like this. The United Kingdom recognized the United States as an independent country, and a massive one at that, with a western frontier extending up to the Mississippi, though the treaty did fail to define the Canadian border, something which caused major problems in the coming decades. The Americans also won lucrative fishing rights off Newfoundland. For their part, the Americans promised to repay their debts to Britain. They also, more vaguely, promised to compensate the Loyalists for the abuses they suffered at Patriot hands, something which the Americans would never actually do. The last party whose consent was needed to make peace was the king himself, George III. He still feared that losing America would mean the end of the British Empire, and the king would do anything to stop that from happening. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Measures so dangerous, Parliament had banned them for 1,000 years.
Alright, Georgie, you can save your empire, but it will cost you dearly.
I'll do anything. Sacrifice anything for the British Empire.
Very well. Prepare to say the magic words.
I'm ready.
Skibbity, skibbity, Ohio Whistler, Giat!
I'd rather let the Empire burn! The Americans abandoned France and won half a continent for it, but the British were still at war. In September, what was supposed to be France and Spain's final assault on Gibraltar failed. The French now insisted on peace. Their agreement looked like this. In lieu of Gibraltar, the Spanish agreed to take all of Florida and Minorca. France only won Senegal and Africa and the Caribbean island of Tobago. The Allies actually occupied many more islands in the Caribbean, but France's defeat at the Saints meant they were likely to lose them if the war continued. France and Spain signed their peace in September of 1783. The Dutch, despite dragging their negotiations into 1784, won nothing. The British gave up America, and in doing so, saved their empire. The question of who's to blame for the loss of America was hotly debated even at the time. British commanders spent a lot of time during and after the conflict in Parliament trying to blame each other for the defeat. Only General Cornwallis and the Admirals Rodney and Howe came out with their reputations intact. But given Britain's system of government, it's hard to really blame anyone in particular. Not even the king could be considered fully responsible. Since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the kings of England were hardly more than figureheads. George III was far from incompetent. He would later lead his kingdom through the crisis of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, reformed the nation's agriculture, and guided England through its early industrialization. George III rightly died, a tremendously popular monarch. Perhaps the question itself is wrong. The story of the American War for Independence is most often told as the story of how the British lost America. But contrary to the narrative of scrappy rebels fighting the greatest empire on Earth, it was the British who were fighting an uphill battle. In cases like Bunker Hill, literally so. As Thomas Paine explained in 1774, "Your failure is, I am persuaded, as certain as fate. America is above your reach. Her independence neither rests upon your consent, nor can it be prevented by your arms. In short, you spend your substance in vain, and impoverish yourself without hope." The United Kingdom was fighting a war across an ocean in a massive country almost universally hostile to its presence, and it could only spare a fraction of the resources its commanders thought they needed to win. There were not enough loyalists in America to maintain control over captured territory, meaning each time the army moved on, thousands of loyalists were forced to flee with them as refugees, fearing Patriot reprisals. As the conflict dragged on, Britain also had to contend with France, Spain, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent, the League of Armed Neutrality. When you consider that fierce array of enemies, it's a testament to the skill of British leadership that the war lasted for as long as it did, and that it did not end in the full partition of their empire and invasion of the home islands. Quoting again from Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy's The Men Who Lost America, "The men who lost America were also the men who saved Canada, India, Gibraltar, and the British Caribbean. The political leadership of the North government can be credited with the victory at the Saints in 1782. The same year, Admiral Howe raised the Spanish siege of Gibraltar, which had been heroically defended by a garrison of German mercenaries and British troops. The final voyages of Captain James Cook to Australia and New Zealand took place during the American Revolution. As the Western Empire partly disintegrated in the Americas, the British were consolidating an Eastern Empire in India. At the death of George III, the British Empire comprised 1/20th of the global population, and was already the largest empire in history, upon which the sun never set. And that's how America, France, and Spain almost destroyed the British Empire. Since you watched this far, leave a wizard emoji in the comments as a secret message to everyone else who got here too. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one. These videos would be impossible without our supporters on Patreon, including our Into Space tier supporters, Commissar Bragg, Duke Nelson, Feline Man, GS Rogers, Josiah, Karazin, Micro, Payter, and Petri von Steiff. You can join them by clicking the link in the description.